Land reform in Zimbabwe. Land has been a source of political conflict in Zimbabwe since colonization, both within indigenous black communities and, especially, between white settlers and the black rural communities. The land distribution in Zimbabwe after colonization was well inclined to the white settlers, who were only 3% of the total population yet controlled 51% of the land, leaving 49% of the land to the 97% of the population. The Zimbabwean government began its land reforms in the 1980s to address the imbalances in land access, ownership and use that had existed in the country before independence. The land reform program in Zimbabwe can be referred to as the transferring of land from a minority white farming group to black. The fast-track phase of its land reform began in 2000, when 10,816,886 hectares were acquired and 162,161 families resettled. A total number of 237,858 households were reported to have received access to land under the program. Thousands of white farmers were forcibly evicted during the process. The reform program was mainly characterized by widespread farm invasions and seizures, which were mostly illegal. The reform has not delivered the outcomes the government intended. It has resulted instead in violence, a lack of legitimacy in land ownership, and a chronic weakening of the country's agricultural infrastructure, all of which have contributed to Zimbabwe's deteriorating social and economic conditions. The agricultural productivity was heavily affected and the manufacturing sector reduced productivity and the whole economy shrunk, and this affected employment levels.
Land reform in Philippines. The disadvantaged rural farming has been inherited from the Spanish labor system that allowed land ownership into the control of the higher-class citizens, while farmers remained sharecroppers. Under sharecropping arrangements, the farmers who cultivated the lands have no freedom to choose crops to farm and had no ability to own the land they tilled. During the American period, the hacienda system had been viewed by the Americans as beneficial to them and encouraged landlords to maintain their power and engage in business, handing out land titles to formalize their claims. Since the early 1900s, the Philippines is considered as one of the countries that has the longest-running land reform programs in the world. Land reform was initially instituted as a developmental program involving mainly the distribution of public lands. However, in 1970s, it became a strategy to develop agricultural productivity by dismantling the hacienda estate system and eliminating inefficient tenancy arrangements in the Philippine agricultural sector. In 1988, the government passed the Comprehensive Agrarian Land Reform Program, CARP, which was created to end unfair land ownership practices by distributing the land and providing proper documentation to its rightful owners, or agricultural reform beneficiaries. But, only 52% of them were able to be provided a land ownership documentation. The Department of Agrarian Reform's first administrative order of 2019 simplified the process of land conversion by enforcing necessary productivity and land use clearances from the Department of Agriculture and Land Use Regulatory Board. To further improve the land reform in the Philippines, the World Bank's executive directors approved the $370 million support to parcelization of lands for individual titling project, SPLIT, which is established to accelerate the subdivision of collective certificates of land ownership award and generate individual titles on lands. The World Bank Acting Country Director for Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand, H.M. Fox, said that the project will provide them the opportunity to receive legal proof and security of individual land rights, and encourage them to adopt better technologies for greater productivity and higher incomes. Accordingly, he added that the improved land tenure security would contribute to poverty reduction and strengthen farmers' resilience against the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. The land reform programs in the Philippines aim to resolve the issues over having no legal ownership rights of rural farmers. The progress and mitigation of poverty through land reforms has been continuously considered for years and has become part of developmental plans for the country. Based on agricultural census data, the period after the reform shows a substantial reallocation of farms and land to smaller farm sizes, with average farm size dropping by about 30%. The figure shows that the share of farms operating below 1 hectare of land increased from 23% in the 1981 census, prior to the reform, to 40% in the 2002 census, after the reform. This presents that by 2002, there is the increase in the access on lands under 1 hectare. Whereas, it can be seen that there is a large decrease of operations or distribution on the land area of 2 to 5 hectares, from over 35% in 1981 to 24 to 25% in 2002. Hence, it shows that there is the decline over the farm size distribution on larger land area in 2002. Policy implications. Land reform is an effective way to foster equal distribution of agricultural incomes and facilitate rural development. However, land reform policy can also be ineffective because of the protracted and poor implementation of the program that moved the agriculture sector backwards. Agricultural land property rights have been complicated by legal restrictions on the transferability of land reform awarded lands, a multiplicity of owners or rights to land, and errors in land reform coverage and beneficiary identification. These issues complicate land transactions and hinder investment into the sector. Under the land reform of Japan, it is supposed that the country has succeeded in the implementation of their policy. The effectiveness in the implementation can be seen as the land accounted for new landowners now increased through conversion of tenants. The country of Cuba has a proper transformation of land reform policy in the country that shows the effectiveness in the implementation. The effectiveness of the policy shows not only for the benefit of the whole country but also to the sake of the farmers. The country of India, specifically in the state of Kerala, was also regarded with land fight. But then after addressing problems and prioritizing the implementation of the policy, Kerala became of the most thoroughly implemented policy in South Asia. There is a popular issue in land conflict in Zimbabwe, South Africa, particularly the matter between the black and white groups. The policy implemented instead results as a failure to the country after violence has occurred that affects the agricultural activity to get weakened. Over the past years, the Philippines has implemented the agrarian reform policy and experienced slow growth and modification of poverty. Since the policy was considered and become part of the development plans of the country, it contributed to poverty reduction. The causes of failure of land reform may be linked to various reasons such as lack of political will, unorganized, inarticulate, and passive nature of agricultural workers, apathetic attitude of the bureaucracy, legal hurdles in the way of implementation of land reforms, lack of uniformity in land reform laws, etc. For a land reform policy to be successful, it must be pragmatic, planned carefully, and executed in a uniformly. In conclusions, the policies and institutions that impede the operation of the land market could prove particularly detrimental when accompanying land reforms. A well-functioning rental market for land can substantially mitigate the negative effects of imposing a more egalitarian distribution of land holdings, as these markets would tend to disassociate operated land from land rights. Delinking land use from land rights can also have substantial effects on migration and occupation decisions, further contributing to increases in farm size and productivity in agriculture. Even if land reforms could potentially generate a productivity gain by channeling land to constrained but productive farmers, the way the reforms are implemented in practice, by administratively reallocating land based on size rather than productivity, critically miss out on this potential gain.